Oh guys, tonight, let your mind drift back in time, past the lights of the modern world, past the hum of machines in cities that never sleep. Let the noise fade until all you hear is the soft breath of wind across stone towers and candlelight flickering on old walls. We're going to a Europe that no longer exists, a world of crowns and cathedrals, of superstition and silence, where every shadow carried a story and every story carried a warning. Imagine you're standing in a narrow corridor of a medieval castle. The walls are cold to the touch, carved from gray limestone that has seen 100 winters. Outside, the forest breathes in mist. The moon hangs low like a coin half buried in fog. Somewhere below, the river whispers against its banks, carrying echoes of songs sung by soldiers who never came home. This is France. The year is 1429, and in a small candle-lit chamber a young girl is praying. Her name is Joanna, though history will remember her differently. Joan of Arc. But tonight she isn't the saint you know from the paintings. Tonight she's just a frightened child kneeling on cold stone, her hands trembling as she whispers to the darkness. She believes the voices she hears are angels. The men around her call them madness. But she believes, and that belief, impossible, fragile, luminous, is about to change the course of history. The night before she meets the Dauphin, she dreams of a crown floating in fire. It doesn't burn, it glows. When she wakes, her pillow is wet with tears, though she doesn't know why. Outside her window, the moon is full, and an owl calls from the woods. To her, that sound is an omen, a sign that heaven is watching. To others, it's the cry of a witch's familiar. You see, in Europe, faith and fear were twins. Every blessing had a curse. Every miracle had a price. And in the halls of power, no one understood that better than the kings who wore the crown. Far from France, across the cold North Sea, the year is 1431. In England, King Henry III sits alone in his chamber at Windsor Castle. He's young. Too young to be a king, and too gentle for the world he was born into. The fire crackles, but the warmth doesn't reach him. On the table before him lies an open letter sealed with black wax. It carries news from Rouen. Joan of Arc has been burned. Henry's advisors call it justice. The church calls it purification. But Henry, in the quiet of the night, calls it something else. He calls it a sin. He's begun to dream again, the same dream every night. A crown made of iron, not gold, a river running red beneath a silver moon, and a voice whispering his name from behind the mirror. Henry was known to see signs in everything. The flight of a bird, the sound of thunder, the way his candle burned low before dawn. He wasn't mad, not yet, but the fear was there, waiting. Every king feared rebellion. But Henry feared something worse, that God himself had turned away. So he built chapels inside his castles, filled them with relics and holy water, convinced that if he surrounded himself with sacred things, his mind would stay clear. But it didn't. The omens grew darker. One night when the moon was red, a lunar eclipse, the king woke screaming. His servants rushed in to find him staring at his reflection in the mirror. "It's not me," he whispered. "It's him." No one ever knew what he meant. But after that night, the cracks began to spread. Through his mind, through his reign, through England itself. Some say the Wars of the Roses didn't start with ambition or greed. They started with a dream of a crown drowning in blood. Travel with me a little further east, across the dark forests of Bohemia, to a castle perched above the Vltava River. It's 1580, and Awesome Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire cannot sleep. He is a man of obsessions, alchemy, astrology, art, and madness. In his chambers he keeps lions and leopards, mechanical clocks that mimic the heavens, and a cabinet filled with jars of mercury and moonstone. His court is the strangest in Europe, full of astrologers, magicians, and philosophers who speak of stars as if they were gods. Rudolph believes the universe speaks in symbols. When a comet appears, he orders the astronomers to track it. When a raven lands on the palace gate, he cancels every meeting that day. He has seen the rise and fall of emperors and the flight of crows. His nights are long. He sits by the window watching the moon reflected in the river below, and wonders what the stars are trying to tell him. He wants to believe that the heavens are a book, and if he can just learn the language, he will find his destiny written there. But the more he studies, the more the lines blur. The alchemists promise gold. The priests promise salvation. The stars promise nothing. Rudolph's court becomes a mirror of his mind, brilliant, eccentric, haunted. And though he rules over half of Europe, he begins to feel as if he's being ruled by something unseen. A whisper, a dream, a superstition he can't quite name. When he dies alone and half mad, they find hundreds of charts scattered across his desk, every one of them drawn to predict a single event. The day of his death. He was only off by one night. Centuries later, in a quiet town in Bavaria, an old clockmaker sits beneath a candle, repairing the watch of a long-dead duke. The gears are gold, the hands are black iron, and in the center is a tiny engraving of a moon. The clockmaker hums softly as he works, but if you listen closely, his tune isn't random. It's an old melody, one once played in Rudolph's court. How does he know it? No one remembers, but somehow across centuries stories travel like dreams. They slip through walls, cross oceans, hide in lullabies and bedtime tales. And tonight, as you lie there in the quiet, maybe they've reached you too. Maybe you can still hear the echo of those ancient halls, the whisper of the crown, the soft murmur of kings who once looked up at the same moon you see now, and wondered what it meant. The century turns. Europe begins to change. The air smells of ink and burning oil, of discovery and danger. The old world of knights and relics is fading, and a new one is being born, full of books, machines, and the promise of reason. But in the quiet corners of candlelit rooms, superstition still whispers. Even as men learn to map the stars, they still believe the stars are watching them back. It is the year Kamwampinwam, and in the city of Monprague, a man named Tycho Brahe builds his observatory. He is no ordinary astronomer. He is a nobleman, a dreamer, and a man who carries a golden nose, literally. In a duel, his own was cut away, and he had it replaced with one forged from brass and gold. They say it gleamed in the moonlight when he worked at night. Tycho spends his life watching the heavens, charting the movements of planets with an obsession that borders on madness. And yet beneath his scientific genius there is still a medieval soul. When a comet crosses the sky, he doesn't just measure its path. He wonders what message it brings. He records it as carefully as he would record the words of a king. Kings, after all, were his clients, and one of them was Rudolf the Dare, the same emperor who stared too long at the moon. Rudolf kept Tycho close not just for his astronomy, but for the comfort his charts brought him. He believed that somewhere in the dance of stars was proof that the universe had order, that his throne was safe, that the chaos of his heart could be translated into circles and numbers. When Tycho died, his apprentice, Johannes Kepler, took his place. Kepler was quieter, humbler, and more faithful. He didn't see the heavens as symbols. He saw them as truth, and yet even he dreamed. He wrote of angels turning the gears of the cosmos, of divine music hidden in the orbit of planets. He was a scientist born from superstition, a bridge between two worlds, the mystical and the rational. That bridge, fragile and shining, is what we now call the Renaissance. In another city far to the west, the air smells different, salt and smoke. This is London, the year 1821. Queen Elizabeth Iron rules England, a woman both adored and feared. Her reign is called the Golden Age, but her nights are haunted. In the quiet hours before dawn, she often summons a man to her private chambers. He is tall, pale, and dressed in black velvet. His name is John Dee, mathematician, magician, and the Queen's astrologer. By daylight, Dee calculates tides and trade routes. By moonlight, he scries in polished obsidian mirrors said to be Aztec relics. He whispers with angels, or so he claims. To the court, he is a curiosity. To the Queen, he is a compass. Before every journey, every treaty, every execution, she asks him to read the stars. And he does. He speaks of Mars rising red, of eclipses, of strange alignments that might mean victory or ruin. He is careful with his words, for he knows that one wrong prophecy could mean death. But sometimes when he looks into the mirror, he sees things he dares not tell her. In one vision, he sees a crown split in two and blood running through the Thames. He closes his eyes, and when he opens them again, the image is gone. But years later, when Elizabeth is gone and civil war divides the kingdom, his vision comes true. People called John Dee a heretic, a wizard, even a spy. But perhaps he was only a man standing too close to the edge of mystery. Perhaps he only tried, as we all do, to find meaning in the dark. Travel north. The wind grows colder. The landscape turns to grey stone and restless sea. You are into Scotland. The year 1603. King James VI of Scotland, soon to be James Court of England, cannot sleep. He believes witches are hunting him, and maybe they are. When he was a young man crossing the North Sea, a storm nearly drowned his ship. His advisors said it was the work of witches from the town of North Berwick, who had cursed the voyage with words written in blood. James ordered them captured. Dozens were tortured, confessed, and burned. The fires glowed red against the mist, and though James won his crown, he never escaped the fear. He wrote a book called Demonology, a guide to understanding and fighting witches. He carried it with him wherever he went, even to bed. But as he aged, his certainty began to crack. He would wake in the night, convinced he heard footsteps near the window. He would smell smoke, though there was no fire. Once a servant found him standing before a mirror, muttering to himself. He said he had seen a woman in the reflection, her mouth sewn shut, her eyes full of tears. No one else saw her. When he died, the mirror was covered with a black cloth. It stayed that way for 50 years. Europe was changing again. Faith was fracturing. Protestants and Catholics waged wars not just for power, but for heaven itself. Superstition became both weapon and refuge. If a harvest failed, they blamed witches. If lightning struck a church, they said it was the devil's hand. And yet in quiet houses and taverns, people still whispered prayers to saints, still kept lucky charms in their pockets, still refused to speak a curse aloud after midnight. Reason was coming, but slowly. And fear is never far from faith. In Florence, at the city of art and ambition, a man named as Galileo looks through his telescope for the first time. He sees the moons of Jupiter, tiny worlds spinning in blackness. He feels awe, then dread. If the earth is not the center, what does that mean for everything he has been taught? He writes what he sees anyway. And for that, the church calls him dangerous. When he is brought before the Inquisition, they demand he deny his discovery. He does, but as he leaves the courtroom, he whispers the words. And yet it moves. The stars have changed. The world has changed. But man's hunger for meaning, the need to find a pattern, to make sense of the silence, remains the same. And so, through the centuries, Europe drifts between light and shadow, from kings to scientists, from witches to philosophers. Everyone is searching for the same thing, a reason to believe they are not alone in the chaos. Close your eyes now. Imagine the cobblestone streets of London after rain, the soft hum of bells from a distant cathedral, the glint of candlelight on old glass. Somewhere, a scholar is writing a book that will change the world. Somewhere else, a peasant whispers a spell to keep her children safe. Both of them believe in their own way that the universe is listening. And maybe it is. Because sometimes when the wind shifts, you can almost hear it, a soft voice in the dark. Older than kings and kinder than fear. It says, "Rest now. The world has always been uncertain. You have always been loved by mystery. So breathe. Let the centuries fade. Let the torches go out. Let the night have you." The candlelight has changed. No longer trapped in castles and monasteries. It now burns on the desks of inventors, poets, and revolutionaries. Europe is waking up. But every awakening leaves behind a dream. And the people of this new century still carry the dreams of the old one. Dreams of prophecy, destiny, and invisible hands that shape the world. It is Paris 6-6. Rain falls over the Seine, silver in the glow of oil lamps. In a narrow attic overlooking the river, a man bends over a parchment covered in circles and numbers. His name is Blaise Pascal, mathematician, mystic, and man of two worlds. He believes in reason, but also in miracles. His mind measures infinity. His heart trembles before it. One night, as thunder rolls over the city, he writes in his diary, "Fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and the learned." When morning comes, he sews that scrap of paper into the lining of his coat. He will carry it there until the day he dies. Even in an age of logic, a man still needs something holy to hold. 100 miles to the north in London, the plague is stalking the streets. The year is Canisfer. Shutters are nailed closed and red crosses are painted on the doors of the dying. Yet in a quiet farmhouse far from the city, a young scholar watches an apple fall from a tree. His name is Isaac Newton, and the world will call what he discovers gravity. But listen carefully to what he says later in life. He calls it not a law but a mystery. He spends as many nights reading the book of Revelation as he does calculating orbits. For Newton, the universe is a cathedral. Every planet is a prayer. Every equation is a hymn. Reason, it seems, does not kill wonder. It only teaches it new language. Now cross the Alps to Venice, Q, the city of masks and mirrors. The year is but 1720, and the carnival fills the streets with color. Among the dancers moves a woman dressed all in white silk, her mask carved into the face of the moon. They call her Contessa Lucia di Rossi, a widow said to own a mirror that shows the future. No one knows if the story is true, but when the Doge himself visits her palazzo and asks what the mirror shows him, she only smiles. You will see, she says. 3 months later, the Doge is dead, struck by fever during a masquerade. The mirror disappears. Some say it was cursed. Others say it was stolen by a French merchant who carried it across the sea. Either way, the tale spreads, and once again the enlightened world finds itself whispering in candlelight. Because even philosophers love a good ghost. Across Europe, coffee houses replace cathedrals. Men debate science and politics under clouds of tobacco smoke. The Cottage of Enlightenment, now they call it. But outside those warm rooms, the poor still pray to relics, and sailors still nail horseshoes to the masts of their ships. Rationality is a luxury. Superstition is survival. In Ibianamitoe, Maria Theresa Modern rules a vast empire. She consults doctors, generals, and Jesuits. But when her favorite daughter falls ill, she summons an astrologer in secret. He tells her that Mars is in opposition and the moon is bleeding. She orders candles lit in every chapel of the city. The child recovers. Was it medicine or the moon? She never asks. She only adds the astrologer to her payroll. By Sunday, the world begins to vibrate with new energy. Philosophers preach liberty. Inventors build machines that roar like thunder. And yet in dark parlors another fashion rises, chaunces. Tables move, candles flicker. Letters appear in soot and ash. The dead, it seems, have found their voice just as the living learn to reason. The heart refuses to be quieted. In Oscar Berlin, a man named Immanuel Kant writes by lamplight, his desk perfectly ordered. He believes reason is the highest power, but even he admits that the starry sky above him fills him with moral awe. He never travels far from his city, and yet through thought alone he builds an entire universe. Outside, snow falls. Inside, another kind of snow, paper and ink, accumulates around him. Each page is a step toward daylight, and still, he pauses sometimes to listen to the wind. He wonders if angels too obey natural law. Now the clock of Europe ticks toward midnight. The year is Goniano and Indoor Parasite. The streets are red again, this time not with sunset but with blood. The revolution has begun. For centuries kings believed God chose them. Now the people claim the heavens have no favorites. On a cold morning, King Louis XVII stands on the scaffold. He looks up at a gray sky and whispers a prayer. There are no omens, no thunder, no signs, only silence. The blade falls clean and final. The crowd roars, but above them the gulls keep circling, indifferent. The age of superstition seems to die with him. And yet that night, an old woman selling candles near the Seine tells a different story. She says she saw a light over the palace, pale blue, floating like a ghost. She swears it followed the procession all the way to the guillotine and vanished only when the king's head touched the basket. No one believes her, but the story spreads anyway, because people still need magic, even in a world that claims to have killed it. When the smoke clears, Europe is reborn. Empires rise and fall, machines replace horses, and the night sky fills with the hum of new ideas. But deep beneath the progress, the old heartbeat continues, the same pulse that moved Joan of Arc, that haunted Henry VI, that guided John Dee's trembling hand over his mirror. It is the heartbeat of uncertainty, the quiet reminder that knowledge does not erase mystery. It only draws the curtain a little higher. So as you lie there, listen to that rhythm, the tick of time, the breath between thoughts, the hush that follows understanding. This is what history sounds like when it sleeps. It hums through cathedrals, through telescopes, through every whisper of the crown that once gleamed beneath a moon that never cared who wore it. Close your eyes. Let the enlightenment fade into dusk. You have traveled from torchlight to lamplight, from prophecy to philosophy, and still the stars remain, older than reason, softer than faith. They are watching as they always have, patient and silent. Rest now, traveler. The age of light is ending, and the age of dreams is about to begin. We're staying in Europe, moving forward through time, from the ashes of the Middle Ages into the dawn of light, love, and reason. Here begins. The night had fallen softly over Europe, wrapping its castles and cathedrals in mist. Far away in the old city of Vienna, a candle burned in the window of a musician who could not sleep. His fingers traced invisible melodies on the edge of his desk. Outside, the snow whispered against the glass. It was the winter of 1791, and the man's name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He was 35 years old and dying, but he did not know that yet. He only knew that there was a darkness closing in around him. Debts, exhaustion, illness, and a strange commission that had arrived from a masked messenger. A requiem, a mass for the dead, to be completed before the end of the year. The messenger had refused to reveal who sent him. "It is for a great man," he said, "and you must not ask questions." Mozart had smiled, but the words stayed in his mind like a chill draft that would not go away. For weeks he worked through the nights, his body weakening, his music growing more powerful. His wife Constanze begged him to rest, but Mozart only whispered, "I am writing this for myself." And when he finally laid his head down, on the night of December 5th, The requiem remained unfinished. In the quiet of his deathbed, he believed he had written his own farewell to the world. But his music didn't die with him. It became the heartbeat of a new age, an age of storms and passion, of revolutions and dreams, the Romantic Age. Across the continent, kings and queens still ruled from glittering palaces, but their power was no longer divine. The French Revolution had shattered that illusion forever. In Paris, the air still smelled faintly of smoke and gunpowder. The guillotine had been dismantled, but its shadow still haunted every street. The people had tasted freedom, and they would not forget it. And yet freedom came at a price. The dream of equality had unleashed chaos, and out of that chaos rose a new kind of ruler. Not born to a throne, but made by ambition. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was small, sharp-eyed, restless, a soldier of fortune who believed that destiny was not written by birth, but by courage. The son of a minor noble from Corsica, Napoleon had clawed his way through the ranks of the army until, by the time Europe realized what was happening, he was emperor of half the continent. But Napoleon did not see himself as a tyrant. He saw himself as a new kind of Caesar, the embodiment of reason and order after the madness of revolution. He reformed laws, built schools, and crowned himself beneath the arches of Notre Dame. He believed he was guided by fate, and perhaps he was for a while. But fate is a dangerous companion. At first it walks beside you, then it begins to lead, and in the end it drags you exactly where it wants you to go. In 1812, when Napoleon invaded Russia with 500,000 men, he believed the world itself would kneel before him. But as his armies marched east, the summer sun burned their strength away. Then came the winter, and the terrible, endless Russian winter that swallowed horses whole and froze rifles in men's hands. By the time they reached Moscow, the city was empty and burning. The soldiers had come seeking glory, but they found only ghosts. Napoleon's retreat was a funeral march through snow. Men stumbled barefoot, wrapped in rags, their breath turning to ice before their lips. Of 500,000, fewer than 100,000 returned. The emperor himself made it back to Paris, but the magic was gone. He had seen what no man should see, the moment when destiny looks away. A few years later, on a lonely island in the Atlantic, Napoleon died in exile. The man who had once ruled Europe was buried beneath a gray sky, watched by a handful of soldiers who still called him emperor. And yet, even in death, his legend did not fade. Because Napoleon was not just a man, he was an idea. The idea that one human being, armed with vision and will, could bend history to his shape. But the 19th century was not only an age of conquerors, it was also an age of dreamers. In the smoky cities of England, poets and painters began to rebel against the cold machinery of reason and empire. They turned instead toward feeling, the power of emotion, imagination, and the wildness of nature. William Wordsworth walked the green valleys of the Lake District and wrote about the holiness of ordinary life. Mary Shelley dreamed of a scientist who tried to create life and instead created a monster. Ludwig van Beethoven, half deaf and trembling, pounded out symphonies that seemed to wrestle with heaven itself. These artists were no longer servants of kings or patrons. They were prophets of the self. They believed that every human being carried within them a universe, and that art could set it free. But even as Europe dreamed, it was building new machines, great iron beasts that roared through the countryside, spitting smoke and sparks. The Industrial Revolution had begun. In the shadow of these factories, cities grew like living creatures. London, Manchester, Berlin, Paris, their streets crowded with workers who toiled for 16 hours a day, their faces black with soot. Children crawled through chimneys. Women carried coal in baskets until their backs bent like question marks. The rich grew richer, the poor grew silent, and the gap between them stretched wider than ever before. Still, the age of invention was unstoppable. Steam engines carried trains across the land. Telegraph wires carried voices through air. The world was shrinking and time itself was speeding up. Europe was entering the modern age, whether it wanted to or not. And yet, in the quiet corners of that restless century, some people still search for mystery. They gathered in candlelit rooms to summon spirits, to read ancient texts, to talk of Atlantis and alchemy. Even as science advanced, superstition refused to die. It merely changed its clothes. Victorian England was filled with contradictions, reason and ritual, faith and fear, progress and nostalgia. A young queen named Victoria sat on the throne, ruling over an empire so vast that the sun never set on it. But behind the polished manners and shining carriages there was unease. London was a city of fog, beautiful, deceptive, dangerous. By day the empire's capital, by night a maze of secrets, opium dens, whispered seances, and the shadow of Jack the Ripper. And through it all the poets kept writing, the scientists kept experimenting, the dreamers kept dreaming. Because Europe had entered a new kind of superstition, the superstition of progress. The belief that knowledge could conquer everything, that machines could perfect humanity, that the dark ages were gone forever. But history has a sense of irony, for as the century drew to its close, strange new terrors began to rise, invisible, ideological and unstoppable. In the salons of Paris, philosophers spoke of anarchism and socialism. In the back rooms of Vienna, doctors dissected the human mind. In the laboratories of Germany, chemists discovered powers that could one day destroy cities. And in the dusty libraries of Europe, historians whispered that every golden age carries within it the seeds of its own collapse. The Romantic Age was ending. The modern world was being born. Far away in a small village on the Rhine, an old man watched the river flowing past. He was a painter, and he had spent his life trying to capture beauty on canvas, sunlight on water, the curve of a leaf, the glow of a human face. But now, at the edge of his years, he finally understood something he had never known before. Beauty, he thought, was not in the world. It was in the longing for it, in the ache that makes us reach out for something we can never quite hold. That was the secret of the Romantic Age, the belief that even in suffering, there is meaning, that even in loss there is love, that to be human is to dream, and to dream is to live. The river flowed on, carrying his reflection away into twilight. Somewhere in the distance a church bell rang, and as the echo faded across the water, it seemed to whisper the last words of the century itself. We have seen empires rise and fall. We have built machines that move faster than the wind. But the only thing that endures, the only thing that ever truly belongs to us, is the dream. The 20th century began not with silence, but with a hum, the hum of machines, the pulse of cities that never slept. Europe stood at the height of its power. Its empires stretched across the globe like a net of gold and steel. The British flag flew over India and Africa. France ruled from Morocco to Indochina. Germany, newly united, dreamed of its place in the sun. And in the east, an ancient empire, Russia, was trembling on the edge of something vast and violent. In the cafes of Paris, young men in tailored coats debated philosophy. In the salons of Vienna, Freud and his students began dissecting dreams, turning the human mind into a new frontier. In London, electric lights had replaced gas lamps. Trains thundered across Europe faster than anyone had imagined possible. The future seemed bright, unstoppable, inevitable, but beneath the elegance something uneasy stirred. The poets could feel it. The artists could sense it. Progress had given mankind wings, but no one had taught it how to fly. In 1903, two brothers in America lifted a wooden machine into the sky. The first flight lasted only seconds, but the world would never be the same. The age of flight had begun. Within a decade, men would be fighting wars in the air, and Europe, proud and glittering, would burn. No one believed it at first. In the summer of 1914, the world was a festival. There were opera performances, garden parties, and parades. But far to the east, in the city of Sarajevo, a single gunshot echoed through the streets. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was dead. The bullet that killed him tore through more than flesh. It tore through the fragile peace of a century. Within weeks, nations began to mobilize. The machinery of war, modern, mechanical, merciless, came to life. When the soldiers marched off to battle, they sang songs of glory and honor. They carried flags and flowers. They thought it would be over by Christmas. It was not. The First World War was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was not fought on horseback or in shining armor. It was fought in mud. Men lived and died in trenches carved into the earth, their boots rotting in cold water, their lungs filled with gas. They called it no man's land, a strip of ground between enemy lines where nothing grew. Nothing moved except death. New inventions made killing faster and more efficient. Machine guns, poison gas, tanks humanity's genius turned inward against itself. New inventions made killing faster and more efficient. Machine guns, poison gas, tanks humanity's genius turned inward against itself. The sky that had once seemed a promise of freedom, now filled with the thunder of bombers. And through it all, generals on both sides kept speaking of honor, of sacrifice, of destiny, as if words could justify the slaughter. 4 years later, when the guns finally fell silent, Europe was unrecognizable. Millions were dead. Millions more were missing. Empires that had stood for centuries, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman Russian had collapsed into dust, and the survivors wandered through the ruins, asking themselves a question that no one could answer. Why? The 1920s arrived like a fever dream. After years of death and hunger, people were desperate to live. They filled the cities with jazz and motion, with champagne and speed. Paris became a carnival of art and rebellion. Hemingway wrote in the cafes. Picasso painted the faces of the new age. In Berlin, cabarets blazed with light and laughter, hiding the darkness that would soon return. Science, too, was rewriting the world. Einstein bent space and time with equations that few could understand. Marie Curie glowed faintly in her lab, chasing invisible rays that could heal or kill. For the first time, humanity felt like a god, able to shape reality itself. But every god creates its own monsters. In Italy, a man named Benito Mussolini rose to power, promising order and greatness. In Germany, a failed artist with burning eyes gave angry speeches in beer halls, blaming others for his country's pain. His name was Adolf Hitler, and the world laughed at him at first. But hunger and humiliation are powerful tools. And when a nation feels broken, it will follow anyone who promises to make it whole again. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. In a few short years, he turned a democracy into a dictatorship. Books were burned, voices silenced, the press censored. Children were taught to salute the flag with trembling devotion. And beneath it all, a new kind of hatred was taking root. Cold, systematic, and lethal. Jews were stripped of their rights, their homes, their names. Neighbors turned against neighbors. The same civilization that had produced Beethoven and Goethe began building concentration camps. Europe, the cradle of art and philosophy, was descending once more into darkness. Meanwhile, across the continent, the world tried to look away. Leaders spoke of peace, of treaties, of reason. They believed that by giving the dictator what he wanted, they could avoid another war. But dictators do not stop. They only pause to reload. In September 1939, German tanks rolled into Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. Once again, the world was on fire. The Second World War was not a repeat of the first. It was something far worse, faster, louder, more total. This was a war of machines and ideologies. The Cold War, they called it, a war without battles, fought in whispers and shadows, in laboratories and in space. On the surface, the world seemed calm. There were no invasions across Europe, no armies clashing in fields. But beneath that calm ran a river of fear, silent and deep. In Washington and Moscow, men in suits sat behind desks, each with the power to end the world with a single order. They built missiles that could cross oceans in minutes, submarines that could vanish beneath the ice, satellites that watched from the sky, and because each side feared the other's finger on the trigger, neither dared to pull it. It was a strange kind of peace, and a peace held together by mutual terror. A cold peace. But human beings cannot live on fear alone. They need purpose, stories, victories. And so the Cold War became a race, and for science, for prestige, for the future itself. In 1957, a sphere of polished metal rose into the sky above Kazakhstan. It was called My Sputniks. and its beeping signal echoed across the world like a heartbeat. For the first time, mankind had touched the stars. And it was not America, but the Soviet Union that had done it first. The West panicked. The East rejoiced. Children stared at the night sky, searching for the tiny moving dot that proved humanity had escaped the Earth. Within years, the race had become a fever. Rocket against rocket, dream against dream. In classrooms, children were taught to hide beneath desks in case of nuclear attack. In deserts and jungles, soldiers fought proxy wars for causes they barely understood. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, each side claimed to be defending freedom. Each side believed the other was evil. And somewhere between those beliefs, millions of ordinary lives were lost. In the 1960s, the world learned to live on the edge. Televisions glowed in living rooms. The Beatles played in Hamburg and London. Students marched in Paris and Prague, shouting that the world could be better. America dreamed of equality. The Soviet Union dreamed of stability, and in the summer of 1961, in the heart of Berlin, a wall rose overnight. Concrete and barbed wire split the city in two, east from west, brother from brother. Families waved across a no-man's land of rubble and guards. It was not just a wall of stone. It was a wall of fear, of ideology, of heartbreak. For nearly 30 years, that wall would stand as the symbol of the century, proof that the cold peace was colder than anyone wished to admit. Yet even amid division, beauty persisted. In 1969, a man stepped onto the surface of the moon. Neil Armstrong's voice crackled through radios across the planet. That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. For a moment, humanity looked beyond its wars, beyond its walls, and saw itself as one. The Earth hung in the blackness of space, small, fragile, astonishingly alive. But back below, the same old shadows moved. Wars still burned in smaller nations. Nuclear arsenals grew. And behind the Kremlin walls and the corridors of Washington, old men played chess with the fate of billions. It was an age of paradox, technology reaching for the heavens while politics sank into paranoia. Through the 1970s, Europe changed quietly. Its cities rebuilt, its people tired of war and ideology. A generation grew up that had never heard sirens or bombs, only the hum of televisions and the rhythm of factories. In London and Rome, youth movements sang of peace. In Warsaw and Budapest, workers began to whisper of freedom. By the 1980s, those whispers had grown louder. A Polish electrician named Lech Wałęsa formed a movement called Solidarity, demanding the right to speak, to vote, to live without fear. Across the Soviet Empire, cracks began to appear, tiny at first, then spreading like light beneath a closed door. And in Moscow, a new leader rose, Mikhail Gorbachev. With his broad smile and the strange word glasnost and openness. He promised reform, freedom, a thaw after decades of cold. But the frozen empire was too vast, too brittle. When it began to melt, it melted fast. In 1989, the world held its breath. Television cameras watched as thousands gathered in East Berlin, chanting, singing, climbing atop the concrete wall that had divided them for a generation. The guards, confused, did not shoot. And then suddenly the impossible happened and the wall began to fall. Hands tore at it with hammers and chisels. Families embraced through the gaps. Champagne spilled over broken bricks. People danced on the wall that had once cast a shadow over the world. In that moment, the Cold War ended, not with an explosion but with applause. It was not a victory of one side over another. It was the exhaustion of both. The old ideologies had burned themselves out. What remained was simply humanity, tired, hopeful, and ready to start again. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. 15 new nations were born from its ruins. The red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. Some wept, some celebrated. The cold peace was over. But the peace that followed was uncertain. A peace built on memories, on promises, on the fragile hope that history would not repeat itself. Europe was free again, but also older, wiser, scarred. It had seen what ideology could do. It had seen the limits of power and the cost of pride. Tonight, if you stand in Berlin where the wall once cut the city in two, you will see a line of light glowing in the pavement. A thin, bright scar marking where history once divided lives. Tourists walk along it with cameras and coffee cups. Children run across it laughing, unaware that their footsteps fall where soldiers once aimed rifles. That is the quiet miracle of history. It turns pain into memory, and memory into lesson. It reminds us that even the coldest wars end not in victory, but in understanding.